All right, kiddos, time for Unit 2. We get to start and break away from where we were kind of focused on the introductory stuff with biology. Time now to look at our next ology, our next branch of biology, ecology. So all we want to do in this introductory video really quickly is to just get a working definition of what ecology is and maybe some of the things that we'll be looking at and studying, kind of a preview, if you will, of ecology. So what is it? We know from our ending with the OGY, it's the study of, but what is this eco part? And it's kind of got a lengthy definition, but we can see it's the scientific study of interactions among organisms and between organisms and their environment, which is, that sounds kind of convoluted and a little sketchy. But what we're really saying is that how do living things interact with each other? How do living organisms interact with their environment? And what is the whole, in this grand scheme of circle of life, if you will, how do they all interact and affect each other? And so essentially what we're saying here is we have to be careful. There are both biotic, living factors, and abiotic, non-living factors, which we'll look at briefly. So this is pretty broad. We can see it's basically we're trying to study almost everything, and that can be complicated, but yet can be rewarding if we know what we're studying and how to study that. So that's our goal. And remember, this is all centered around our study of Winnipeg salt pond and the big problem that we were presented with there. So yeah, it's nerdy, but let's look at this a little more specifically. So we know what ecology is. Definition of, oh my gosh, all of these interactions, and that's kind of broad and vast in its scope and its scale there. But with this whole biotic and abiotic factors, just to look at them quickly. Biotic, remember, means life and living, the living organisms. The abiotic, that prefix A, means non-living factors. So think for a second. I'm going to ask you to pause the video here and briefly, just for 30 seconds or so, try to list any factors that you think, if we're studying living organisms and their environment and their interactions, what are some non-living aspects that might play a very important role? So go ahead, pause the video and try to quickly jot down a list of 3 or 4 or 5 things, and when you're ready, unpause it and we'll look at some examples. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance with your generate a list there. Let's take a look at what some of these are. Temperature is a big one. And we've actually looked at temperature a little bit in some of our previous activities, but temperature is not alive, it's not a living aspect, but it's what's going on around organisms that certainly can affect not only organisms, but can definitely affect other non-living factors as well. Things like light, dissolved oxygen, how much oxygen is in the water. We can see that has a direct correlation to light and especially temperature. As generally speaking, we'll see later on that as temperature goes up in an aquatic environment, in a pond, dissolved oxygen usually goes down. And vice versa. As the temperature goes down, dissolved oxygen goes up. So again, this is not a living factor. It's not an organism, but it certainly affects and is affected by organisms. As well as that, along that same line, carbon dioxide, pH, which remember is a measurement of hydrogen ions. A low pH means an acidic environment. High pH means a basic environment. Things like nitrates and nitrites, especially nitrates, we'll be concerned with that. We'll see why later on. We'll actually be testing that in the field. Soil makeup, and essentially we can go on and on. But all of these are non-living aspects, things that are not alive, but that play a huge role in an ecosystem with organisms. So very, very important. Turbidity, again, an aquatic one we'll look at. So remember that most of these abiotic factors, something that we got to keep in mind is that they're usually easily measurable using standard equipment, vernier probes, and like for example, we're going to be using these probes, which you've already practiced in class, using Logger Pro software. Plug them in, a sensor will measure how much DO, for example, or what the pH is, or how many nitrates using these probes, and it gives you immediate feedback, which is great because if you know what the abiotic factors are like, you can then determine how that's going to affect biotic, the organism. So very, very important here. So remember, again, I'm kind of kicking a dead horse, but these abiotic factors affect the living organisms, and the living organisms affect abiotic. For example, the more a fish breathed in a pond, that would draw down the oxygen and would push up the CO2. So these two are very, very closely related. And if you think about it, this kind of got a little cut off here, but butterfly effect. There's an ancient parable that I'm totally paraphrasing in essence that says something along the lines to the extent of as if a butterfly, excuse me, on one side of the world flaps its wings, it can cause a tsunami or a hurricane or something on the other side of the world. Now, obviously, this little butterfly here flapping its wings is not going to cause a tsunami. But what they mean by this is that this butterfly flapping its wings causes something else, which in turn happens and causes two other something else's, which cause a bunch of other things. We can think of this actually as also another name for that would be domino effect. Think of with dominoes. One event happens, one thing transpires, and then it'll lead to a bunch of other series of events that eventually could cause the tidal wave. So what we're looking at with that very simply is everything is interrelated in ecology, and it's going to be our job to understand ecology so well that we can then predict these butterfly effects, and you'll hear this term more and more often later on. So that brings us to our final part here, is that if you were an ecologist, what exactly would you be studying then? I mean, I'm studying ecology, but on a more specific note, like, here's an ecologist. If you look at this picture, feel free to pause the videos here and ask yourself, what could this ecologist literally be studying? He's not trying to crush this bird's skull. He's measuring the length from beak to the back of the cranium. Got a little field notebook. Look at the beautiful area where he is. I mean, that's unreal. It doesn't get much better than that. But what might he be studying? Show you a couple of examples here. This chick, who is also an ecologist, but maybe not very smart. I don't know if I would want to be a warm-blooded mammal sitting on the ice, just like a seal, next to these killer whales who like to eat seals. But she's out in the field. Might be studying something ecologically. Think about what she may be looking at. This guy looks like he's creeping around in a tent. He is not. He's using something called a quadrant. He's trying to study something in there, something on a small scale. Think about what might he be looking at. Even to as far as this guy, dipping nets in a pond. All of these people we've looked at are ecologists studying something in the field. And think about some type of interaction between biotic and abiotic factors. Because what we're going to end up seeing is the fact that in this case, we have on the planet a wide array of topics that we can study. All right, so with that in mind, then, let's just look quickly at some of the different levels you could study ecology at to give you a better idea of what you could be studying. We could study specifically just a species. Now, this would be our smallest level. For example, if we're studying, in this case, hopefully living in Westerly, you know what this guy is, a striped bass. If we're studying that, we may just be studying just the species of striped bass. How does this particular species breed? What's their average size of fertile offspring? We're studying just striped bass. That would be our smallest level. We could bump up to the next level, a population. In terms of ecology, a population in particular is just one particular species, individual, sorry, in a particular area. So we could study a population of striped bass living in Watch Hill. Now here we're concerned with not just striped bass generally, and we're becoming a little more broad of just that group living in Watch Hill. How big do they get? What do the individual populations in Watch Hill eat? When do they mate? What kind of attributes do they prefer? So you can see our level of study just got a little bit larger in what we're doing. We could then bump up to study a community. Think about what a community is. In a community, like the community in Westerly, you're studying all of the populations, all of the species that live together in that defined area. So it's not just striped bass, it would be the striped bass with every other living organism that's around them and how they interact. So like in this forest example, we're not studying just deer or a population of deer. We're studying the deer, all the plants, all of the other small mammals, all of the insects, the birds, the trees, and how all of them interact. So you can see we just got much larger in our scope, in our sequence of what we're studying. There's a lot more going on in the community than there is in a population. And in our last one, we can actually, the larger one, we can study an ecosystem. And this is probably the most advanced and actually what we're going to be looking at in our field trip. Here you're studying all the organisms that live in that place, plus all the non-living, all the abiotic factors. And in here I gave an example of a coral reef, but you can see, yeah, there are some living things, some fish. There's coral, there are sponges, there's microscopic plankton. But there also would be a lot of non-living factors like temperature, salinity, sunlight, pH, nitrate levels, as we said. All of those and all of the living organisms and the non-living factors are interacting to affect this environment. So you can see an ecosystem is the broadest, is the largest amount of stuff, if you will, that we need to worry about. So there's a lot in ecology, but if we're careful and we know what to study with some basic skills, we can learn quite a bit about an ecosystem, and depending on our focus, we can zoom in to study species, populations, etc. But our general definition is the same for ecology no matter what we're studying. All the biotic and abiotic factors in that area. So now that we end with a working definition of ecology, it's up to us to practice some of the tools and tricks before we move on to our second video and start looking at specifics. But you all, our goal for all of us is to use Winnipeg ecosystem, the salt pond, as our ecosystem of study to focus our problems on. And all of you are going to practice activities and watch videos like we've done in the past to become ecologists and then apply your area of expertise to solve the big problem in Winnipeg Salt Pond. So good luck. It's going to be fun.